Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. You are here at the side event titled Securing Women's Land Rights as a Climate Change Strategy. My name is Katia Araujo. I'm Director of Advocacy with Landesa. Landesa is an international non-governmental organization. We work across 50 countries, specifically using and enhancing the power of land rights to eliminate extreme poverty. And we also focused on the enhancement and achievement of gender equality and women's empowerment within land rights context. I will have with us today on the panel 4 colleagues, and I will pass the word for them to introduce themselves. I will start with our colleague Kelly Stone. She's the Senior Policy Analyst with ActionAid USA.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm excited to be talking about this issue. ActionAid is an international federation working on issues of social justice, including climate justice and extreme poverty. And I'm excited to talk about how women are at the center of solutions.
We are going to go through 3 sets of questions, and the panelists will answer each question, and then we will take off to the audience for any questions that you would like to address at the end of the 3 questions. The first questions I would like to address to Kelly, since she introduced herself, is especially from the perspective of her area of work, and Kelly is going to be addressing biofuels and how that can really address food security and land tenure security. And the question is, how does your work support women's ability to enhance resilience to the impact of climate change?
Thank you so much. So first, I do want to say that, in the field, it's really, and when working with local partners, it's really important to put women at the core of resiliency work and emergency response. But I do want to talk about, as was just alluded to, one of the things that we're doing here in this kind of space, and that's recognizing particular technologies and supposed climate solutions that are being pushed forward that are a real threat to land rights, and that leaves women farmers particularly at risk because of some of the structural disadvantages they're already facing. They're particularly vulnerable to land grabs. So we're focusing quite a bit on concerns about technologies such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is frequently relied on in IFPRI pathways as a way to sort of undo emissions and remove emissions from the atmosphere. But the problem with this is that this technology has a lot of problems with it and is not likely to work, first of all. But second of all, it requires millions of hectares of land, possibly into the billions of hectares of land. And there simply isn't enough land on the planet to have that be feasible, even if the technology did work, without really having major conflicts with food security and particularly land rights. So we're quite concerned about making sure that land rights and women's rights are really at the starting point of climate action and not something that needs to be fixed or patched later. I think I'll leave it there. Mm-hmm. I can leave it there.
Okay. So you see that Kelly was really addressing how biofuels, if implemented at a large scale, can really threaten food security and security of tenure, and specifically in the context of women's impact on that large-scale implementation. I would ask my colleague Beth Roberts to please answer this first question.
Thanks, Katia. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. It's good to see all of you here. So as Katia mentioned, my name is Beth Roberts, and I work for the Landesa Center for Women's Land Rights, which is a program within Landesa that focuses particularly on the rights of women within rural settings that we work in. We currently have active projects in 3 countries in Asia and 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And so our work connects to climate change in both a negative direction and a positive direction. So in the negative direction, we see climate change as a compounding effect of the consequences of insecure land tenure for rural women and men living in poverty. And in the positive direction, we see effective mitigation of and adaptation to climate change as outcomes of our work. So in this positive direction, we see the rights to land result in practices that help mitigation and adaptation efforts. This could include fallowing, intercropping, crop rotation, agroforestry, tree planting, terracing, the kinds of investments that also lead to agricultural productivity and reduce food insecurity, but the kinds of investments that are only made when people have the correct incentives. And the knowledge that the land is yours and that no one will suddenly take it from you is a powerful incentive. And in the case of women's land rights, these positive effects may be increased. Women tend to be more receptive to innovations in climate action that may preserve the resources that they rely on. And when women have land rights, their income and their family's income increases. In turn, they're more likely to focus on family nutrition and educational spending. And together, these factors make rural families more resilient when they are impacted by climate change and more able to adapt. And in the negative direction, climate change increases the hardships and the disadvantages that women already face, which Kelly already alluded to. We encounter over and over again in our work the effects of the land degradation that affects 1.5 billion people worldwide. We focus in our work on the effects of particularly slow onset disasters caused by climate change, and this includes flooding, droughts, sea level rise, and land degradation, and all of these disproportionately affect women. And why are they disproportionately affected? Women are less likely relative to men to migrate in search of work, and that means they are left caring for children and elderly family members as well as managing land, but they're doing it without the legal rights that allow them to make decisions, leverage the land as collateral, and get access to agricultural inputs that would help them keep their land productive. They're more likely than men to suffer from malnutrition when food is scarce due to lower crop yields as a result of droughts or degraded soil. And these disadvantages are entrenched without climate change as a compounding factor. Women most frequently access land through male relatives. They're included from decision-making on land at all levels, from the household level to the international level. They face inequitable laws, both formal and customary. And finally, their unique interests, roles, and uses of land are too often inadequately considered in climate change programming. For instance, a shift to intercropping can cost women their control over particular crops, or a REDD+ program may exclude women from gathering non-forest timber resources that they depend on but men don't. These are problems we're trying to address both in the negative direction and opportunities we're trying to help women capitalize on in the positive direction. The effects on the planet can go either way, and that's up to us, and that's why we're here trying to make these links between land rights, especially for women, and climate change.
Thank you, Beth, for highlighting how your work does address and enhance women's resilience to climate change. I would like now to ask Claudia Ringer from IFPRI to introduce herself and share with us how your work supports.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Claudia Ringer with the International Food Policy Research Institute. We are one of 15 international agricultural research centers with the mandate to support developing country food security, nutrition security, while safeguarding the environment. And of course, land rights is climate change interactions are a very important topical area within that mandate. While I'm not a land rights specialist, as some of the other people on the panel, I do coordinate a project that certainly relates with land rights, and it's called the Gender, Climate and Nutrition Integration Initiative, so a lot of words. And it was basically started to support the 2016 US government global food security strategy that for the first time has elevated resilience as a key objective together with agriculture-led growth and nutrition to address hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. While the initiative, as I said, doesn't directly focus on land rights, we are implementing a whole bunch of research and supportive activities, and I think one that might be of interest to the land rights discussion is the so-called GCAN framework. It's a framework that I think for the first time has integrated nutrition and gender within climate resilience strategies to help support programming to ensure that climate resilience strategies don't adversely affect nutrition and women's empowerment. And so what we have done there is use the traditional IPCC definition of climate signal, climate sensitivity, which is we call absorptive capacity and also the adaptive capacity. And those capacities together with the climate signal actually affect the response options that women and men have in the in this climate resilient space. And adaptive capacity, one of an important variable that defines adaptive capacity are land rights. So if there is stronger tenure security, we are more likely to see a much stronger adaptation response. But what are the types of responses that women and men, farmers and rural dwellers generally employ? We see the coping strategy. So when we have climate extreme events, we don't have strong adaptive capacity. So coping could be selling food, selling assets like land, which is better than if you have nothing to sell. But there's also risk management strategies, adaptation strategies, and transformational strategies. And we believe that stronger women's land rights actually support transformational strategies. The pathways within this response option space that this framework identified include food production, obviously changes in that production space, income generation, asset development. Again, land is, to some extent the most important asset in the agriculture space. But also changes in labor use, natural resource management. We have heard quite a few points already how natural resource management can change when we have changes in women's land rights, and of course also the cooperation institutional space. So all of these elements are gendered and then lead to a whole bunch of outcomes in the health, environment, and food security space. And those in turn affect, of course, emissions and the resilience. And we are currently, we've had a call for projects to basically be analyzed using this framework to identify best practices that then we hope the US government, programs, missions, and obviously other partners might be interesting to adopt and adapt. And we had 52 projects that were willing to do that, and the results should come out later this year. And there's a flyer on the framework that you can find here at the bottom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Claudia Ringer, for sharing with us how your work is supporting, which is a very interesting framework. I now would like to pass the mic to Alain Frechette to introduce himself and share a little bit of how the breadth of his work supporting this effort.
Yes. Thank you. Well, yes, my name is Alain Frechette. I'm a forester by training and director of strategic analysis at the Rights and Resources Initiative. I'm by no means a gender specialist, but I got a quick and early crash course in my education towards women's rights and their importance. It was some 20 years ago when I started in the international development field. I was working for a private firm specialized in monitoring and evaluation, and one of the partners was retiring. And so I asked him, after 25 years of engagement and doing this kind of work, what do you know works? What are the best solutions for resolving the world's problems? And he simply put it to me in a very British and a conservative way: just make sure you get women and girls, their bloody rights respected, and everything else will fall into place. And I guess that's where I come from, and that's what I learned, and I'm pleased to be here. This is the first time that I get to engage on this important issue, and showcasing a lot of the work that my colleagues are doing. ARI contributes to strengthening the resilience of women in the context of climate change by supporting the role and contributions of indigenous peoples, local communities, in both climate and development priorities. Essentially what we're finding is that if we're serious about tackling deforestation, the SDGs, and meeting the Paris Agreement, then we need to be serious about securing tenure rights. Legally recognized community rights forests tend to store more carbon, experience lower rates of deforestation, and benefit more people than forests managed by either public or private entities. And rural communities and smallholders, as Beth and Claudia alluded to, produce over 80% of the food consumed in the developing world. We also know that these goals will not be reached if indigenous and rural women do not have secure rights to control, manage, and access community lands and forests. Tenure security for women is essential for protecting their personal agency and economic security, as we've heard already. We know from community mapping exercises, collective decision-making processes, and the application of safeguards such as EFPIC, that in the absence of clear and secure rights for women, over half of their territory's resource needs and social economic requirements will be misrepresented, resulting in weak and unsustainable land use agreements that are detrimental to both communities and their environment. And in the context of increasing male-out migration and demographic shifts, women are assuming an increasing share of the costs and responsibilities for managing and protecting community lands and forests. As shown in a recent analysis that's up front here, and I invite you to take up a copy of this, we looked at legal frameworks in 30 low middle income countries and found that that actually none of these countries, which cover over 78% of the world's developing forest area, none of these areas secure women's tenure rights. Less than 5% of the legal frameworks that we analyze adequately protect women's rights to actively participate in community-level governance, including their ability to vote, engage in decision-making processes, or assume leadership roles. And 73% of the legal frameworks examined failed to address community inheritance rights of women, thus hindering their social and economic security altogether. In short, our work shows that indigenous and rural women are a key part of the climate solution and the growing threat of inequality. Their participation in natural resource governance and decision-making processes is vital to the welfare of indigenous people, local communities, and the world as a whole.
Thank you, Alain. Thanks for sharing that with us. I think it's really great to hear what all those different partners and we are trying to really work together and work from a perspective of really trying to break the silos and start a dialogue and enhance our understanding and enhance ways of how to really address the issue of climate change, the impact of climate change from a holistic, integrated perspective. And here on the table, I hear that many of the organizations partnering this panel, we all come from different areas, and we are working towards addressing development challenge, but we are dialogue and understanding what's the interplay of securing tenure rights to land specific to women, rural women, indigenous women, even within communal claiming rights, and how that interplays with the interplay of food security, of resource rights, with the impact of biofuel large-scale implementation, how that has been threatening those rights. Given that we are talking about the integration of indigenous and rural women's rights to secure tenure, I would like to ask our panelists to share a little bit from their perspective and for the large breadth of work, what specific interventions and strategies are actually really meaningfully and effectively showing some concrete impact. I think we are all here, we have been working in this area and we have achieved pretty progressive global frameworks from the 2030 Development Agenda Framework to the volunteering guidelines on the tenure of governance, land, and fishery. We are here trying to understand how we are going to support the process of implementing the Paris Agreement and continue to hold to account the governments to those obligations that we have secured in the Paris Agreement. So I think now it's time for us to discuss what can we capitalize and leverage from the large breadth of work organizations and partners and different stakeholders have been doing at the ground level, the research, the integration of research and practice, trying to close that gap. So I would like the panelists to really kind of articulate and share what are those specific, what it is, how are we telling the governments to implement those policies that we have written on paper? What are those strategies, interventions that can be shared that have really demonstrated some impacts to address climate change.
Sure, I will start again. So forest ecosystems and agroecologies are really important tools, I think, for us to get to 1.5 and implement these strategies. And the best way to actually use that is by putting land rights for women and communities really at the core. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that colleagues in ActionAid Vietnam are conducting right now, and that's having women are really leading the way in reforestation projects there. And so these projects not only have the possibility of enhancing natural carbon removals and being really effective climate actions, but they're also providing a lot of adaptation benefits to the communities as far as protecting watersheds, restoring soil degradation, as an income generator by things that are being grown in the forests. And women really, when they're playing leading roles in the design and implementation of these forest-based livelihood models, this can be quite a technical exercise putting it together. And so interventions to help facilitate knowledge sharing and study tours can be really helpful, but we're also then benefiting from the knowledge the women have of the local area. Nobody knows their areas better than they do, and so they know what's really going to work in their communities and how to make sure that this project is actually effective, as opposed to something with good intentions but ultimately does not deliver on what we need it to, both for the community and for the climate. So one of the other things that ActionAid did there was setting up knowledge kiosks with internet connections and trainings to help the women access information to see where their land was being recorded, was it being recorded properly, how they could dispute that if it wasn't being recorded properly, but then also information on, you know, what prices were at local markets, what had been happening with, you know, when was a good time to be selling shrimp? When did you want, you know, when were people having success planting different things? So that access to information combined with the women's local knowledge we found to be really effective. I'm going to talk about one other program actually in Malawi. We have an agroecology project in Malawi that actually came out of a reflection circle where one of the things the women had identified was a real lack of livelihood and food security for their communities. So they were looking really for an adaptation plan. They wanted to diversify their livelihoods and they wanted to ensure better food security for their community. But by implementing agroecology, that's also that is the best way of farming that we have to prevent emissions from agriculture. Agriculture in industrialized context is very heavy on the emissions. And so by putting food security and these women's decision-making rights at the core, they came to the best solution for their communities that was also good for the climate. And so we see these as really an important, it's about the approach. Putting women and their rights at the core unlocks all of these solutions. I think I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thank you. Next volunteer to answer that question.
Sure.
Share a case.
So I'll share an example that's very much in process for us as an organization. We take a combination of law and policy reform and project design and implementation approaches. And for the past 2 years, we've been working in Myanmar, working with the government on their national land use policy and on a nationwide land allocation and return program. And this program is meant to address issues associated with over 50 years of military junta rule that included widespread land grabbing by members of the military and their cronies for their own use, for speculation, and for sale to corporations. And all of this was at the expense of smallholder farmers, or the bulk of it was. The National League for Democracy, or the NLD, which is Aung San Suu Kyi's party, has been resuming land, so taking it back under the control of the government and working to identify both those who were affected by land grabbing and landless agricultural workers, and to make sure that land is returned or allocated to them. And Myanmar is hard hit by climate change, both in the lowland delta areas in the south due to flooding, storms, and increased salinity, and in the dryland areas in the north due to land degradation. And one of the biggest problems with Myanmar's laws from a climate change perspective is that their current farmland law prohibits shifting cultivation, and there's been a history of imposed rice production quotas by the government that also has limited farmers' choice. And through continued advocacy over this period of time, Landesa has been able to persuade the government to include provisions in their forthcoming amendments to the farmland law that lift those restrictions on shifting cultivation. And so this will allow for practices that contribute to mitigating climate change efforts, including crop rotation, fallowing, and increased terracing and tree planting. And this means that this sets up Myanmar agriculture for being increasingly effective as carbon sink. And so how does this connect to women's land rights? So here's where it gets a little sticky. Our policy advocacy on gender and women's land rights was well received by the government, but they have not prioritized our proposed provisions in the current phase of legislative reform. Myanmar is different from many countries we work in that there's a good deal of national pride about gender equality, but in practice, women are still very disadvantaged by strict patriarchal roles. And this means that there are great challenges, but it also presents a great opportunity to leverage those attitudes. For instance, in our work with our Burmese staff, we're emphasizing the importance of including all members of the household or community on applications for land use rights under this allocation and return program. And so we hold community meetings and present the community with the proposition that women's names should be included because there is gender equality, and we all know that gender is equal in Myanmar. And then communities agree, and because the law itself is gender neutral, this allows for this sort of backdoor for women's land rights. And as we continue to advocate through the legal processes for women's land rights to be formally included in law, we'll continue to also work to ensure that this formalization process that's already underway is creating opportunities for women rather than entrenching discrimination through formalizing only men's rights. And that allows women to benefit under this new freedom to cultivate these provisions in the law, and allows them to equally participate in and contribute to practices that mitigate climate change. And I offer this example because this is a tricky context for gender justice, to show that progress toward empowering women as agents of climate change action is possible, even when it's difficult, and that there are always ways to strengthen women's land rights in the face of challenges or outright resistance. And I believe I'm at time for this question, but we also have examples from our work in Ghana and China that I'm happy to expand on in our discussion time.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Again, a slightly different perspective from me. My colleague, Ruth Meinzendick, and colleagues recently implemented a systematic review of women's land rights and poverty linkages. And 5 of those pathways from women's land rights to poverty are actually associated with climate resilience. And I guess I'll quickly explain those, because we're supposed to say what works, or what has the literature shown that works in that climate resilience space. So women's land rights, according to this systematic review, is directly linked with resilience, because women, once they have secure tenure, can actually sell part of their land, so, for example, following a climate extreme event. Women's land rights are also associated with increased investments in inputs, but especially also technologies and changes in natural resource management that can be increased resilience. Especially, and again, within this NRM and technology space, women's land rights particularly contribute to practices and technologies that take much longer to mature, such as fallows, soil and stone bonds, so some of the agroecological approaches, but also more expensive technologies. You know, for example, there might be an interest to purchase an irrigation technology that then again might further support resilience. The literature also often suggests that women's land rights are associated with enhanced access to credit, which again, for example, land could be used as a collateral to buy inputs for increased productivity or technologies. But interestingly, the literature actually doesn't find, there's barely any evidence that this particular pathway actually operates. And so why is this the case? I mean, again, if you remember what I mentioned about this climate resilience, gender nutrition framework, there are so many other factors that affect women's access to credit. Secure tenure is one, but there's access to information, there's a time burden. So there's a whole bunch of other cultural adaptation and absorptive capacity challenges that operate as well. Women's land rights can be linked to women's empowerment. For example, or because tenure of land can provide new decision-making power for women through this land, through this land property, also more bargaining power within the household, and it can open new roles in decision-making bodies. For example, if a woman owns a piece of land, they might be invited to participate in a water use association, and as such, basically, just have a broader space over decision-making, even in a larger area or in the community. And input providers and others might suddenly be interested to talk to women because they actually have something to say about a piece of land. Maybe a little bit less direct, but also I find of interest is that climate change and women land rights are also linked to HIV/AIDS. Previous study, not part of that systematic review, but also by IFPRI colleagues, has shown that adverse climatic extremes, particularly prolonged droughts in Africa, have are directly linked to HIV/AIDS because women actually leave the land and leave the family to earn income as prostitutes, and that's directly linked to climate change. At the same time, a study in Kenya in the systematic review found that women's land ownership is directly associated with lower likelihood of engaging in transactional sex for survival. So we do see an increase in HIV/AIDS as a result of droughts and climate change, and we do see women's land rights as a potential entry point to address that. So this sounds all good. So we do see a lot of potential for increased climate resilience through women land rights, and also a lot of evidence that this is happening. But again, I think it's important to be aware it's not like there's a land right for a woman, everything will get better. So we do need to make sure that all the other surrounding factors are taken care of. And just one quick example from a study that I coordinated, and there's a set of briefs down there and also 3 copies of the systematic review. It's pretty heavy, but it's also online. So the study looked at the Ethiopian land tenure system, which is considered very positive, very strong. Women are on the title, their picture's on the title, so the land cannot directly be sold without, if it's the wrong woman trying to sell the land, hopefully the picture still tells us that there's a mistake. But what we found is that even so, there's a pretty strong women's land rights system in Ethiopia. We did not find a direct increase in so-called climate resilience strategies, such as soil and water management, agroforestry practices, or the planting of nitrogen, fixing crops. And the reason was because women had very limited knowledge about the land rights. They didn't understand what it actually means. Can they sell the land? Can they inherit the land? What happens if their spouse dies? So this limited knowledge about what the land rights actually entailed, limited then or directly, was directly linked to them not adopting those practices. So we need both the land rights systems and we need to confer the knowledge about those systems, because otherwise we can say we have here a woman who has a right to land, and now we know there'll be more climate resilience. So that's again not a given. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, for giving us that clear example. I would like now to invite Alain Frechette to share with us a case study from his work.
Yes, thank you. RI principally intervenes in several ways. We focus on strategic analysis in advocacy and convening at local and global levels, as well as supporting locally led initiatives. Our work is fundamentally guided by and structured by local needs and demands. So we respond to our constituencies and what they want and support their efforts. So it really, we're supporting their agenda and bottom-up efforts as much as we can. I'll just name a few examples of things that we've done that have been successful in the recent past. RI has helped establish a number of women's network. One of the most compelling example is REFACOF, the African Women's Network for Community Management of Forest, which is present in 17 countries in West and Central Africa. REFACOF has managed to develop an incredible streamline of work that includes business development opportunities for women in the forest sector, contributing to transferring technologies and working in close collaboration with governments and elected officials to strengthen their capacity and promote gender equality across their laws and regulations. In 2016, we were requested by NORAD to work with civil society actors and indigenous representatives, as well as government officials in both DRC and Colombia, to host national workshops and provide training to key actors on the linkages between gender rights, RED, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, community forestry, and tenure rights, with the goal of developing roadmaps and action plans for mainstreaming women's rights in all of these processes. In both cases, the results were quite compelling. In DRC, the government, as a result of that, established a directive that required the involvement of women in all community-led resource initiatives and governance structures. And in Colombia, it resulted in prolonged engagement for the legal recognition and participation of indigenous, Afro-descendant, and peasant women land rights in the context of the newly developed peace accord and subsequent climate investments. In Peru, RI Coalition supported efforts of indigenous and local community organizations to include gender policies and safeguards in national and regional procedures for collective titling efforts supported by climate financing. More globally, RI partners and affiliated networks such as Tebteba and AIPP, among others, contribute extensively to the GCEF's upcoming Indigenous Peoples Policy to ensure that it brings visibility to Indigenous women in the context of GCF projects. And in Nepal, the Federation of Community Forest User Groups, Forest Users of Nepal, FECOFUN, conducted a successful advocacy campaign to raise awareness about the draft forest rights law and obtain quotas for the election of women representatives in local government. Collectively, that resulted in the election of 810 FECOFUN members, among which 253 were women. This represents a major victory for Nepali women and will open doors for both local and national decision-making arenas. Finally, and least but not least, RI's entire governance structure is guided by prominent women leaders active in the land rights agenda. So we have the likes of Vicky Tolikarpes, the UN Special Rapporteur on the UN on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Ruka Sombalingi, Secretary General of Oman, the world's largest Indigenous Peoples Alliance, Myrna Cunningham, who's now Chair of the Tenure Facility, Cecilia Njebet, President of Refacov, and Nonet Royo, who's Executive Director of the newly created International Land, Tenure, and Force Facility, to name but a few who are now guiding and directing our work. So, yeah, so essentially.
Okay, thank you, Alain. I think we heard here from the panelists a very wealth and broad breadth of interventions and ways of working that that was shared. I capture a few threads that I saw commonly coming across when our panelists shared. And I think one of them was the issue of the legal empowerment of indigenous and rural women to really understand the governance of land, the governance, management of land and natural resources is important. The organizing, the collective voice, and the meaningful participation in those strategies and interventions that in participate in the designing and in the development and implementation. I saw here the recognition, but also the integration of the local knowledge from rural women and indigenous women on those strategies. I saw that in interventions, successful interventions. I saw that coming across what was shared. I also see that one other element is the position of indigenous and rural women in the process, but not just the recognition of the importance of participation and but going beyond the recognition, the representation, but the positioning of indigenous and rural women in the decision-making of management of land and natural resources. I just wanted to highlight that I feel I captured in those cases and examples of ways organizations are working and examples of interventions being implemented. We have one third question about what would see, what it's needed to be different in order for us to capitalize and leverage from what is working. But before going to this third question with our panelists, because we heard so many examples from the panelists, I would like to open up the floor and have the audience kind of asking any questions or comments, inputs, compliments. Please, you can walk to the aisle and approach the microphone. Introduce yourself, say your name, where you're from, and address the question to the speakers. Or
hello, thanks for that session. I'm Mrinalini Shinde. I'm an environmental lawyer from India. My question was specifically with respect to the projects which are run in countries which have very strong customary law systems. And often, because I do research in customary law, we have to, when trying to use local customs in order to safeguard environmental rights, often women's land rights tend to be neglected in the advocacy of such customary legal systems. So that tends to be a criticism of even using customary environmental law because of the consequences for gender rights. So I just wanted to know how you tend to deal with those conflicts between environmental justice and women's land rights when trying to adopt a customary environmental law in your advocacy. Thanks. Thanks, that's it.
thank you. I will take a round of questions, perhaps 5.
Sorry.
We can hear you, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yes, you're fine.
So thank you very much. I was really interested in the example of the linkage with HIV and AIDS, and I wondered if there were any further reflections on the relationship between land rights and sexual and reproductive rights and health. Thank you.
Hi. Most of the examples that were given seem to be about situations where the major problem to be overcome was social, educational, and to do with kind of changing the way that things kind of have historically worked. But what can be done, if anything, in situations where there's an explicit legal issue? So, for instance, if in any dispute the testimony of a woman would not be considered reliable because of the legal code of that area, or if there was, or if you're actually in a place where women just legally can't own property, what do you do then?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm just curious in learning more about how you are you see the implementation of land tenure and specifically focusing on food security and sovereignty in the negotiations here at COP. How are these solutions being implemented and what more work needs to be done?
I'm Colin Pringle from Fauna and Flora International. So first of all, thank you to the panelists for sharing your experience and background. In my professional experience, I've got no doubt that women's land rights is a key issue in terms of climate change strategy. And I kind of assumed that was common sort of in the field, and particularly amongst practitioners who are doing projects on the ground. So I was expecting this event to be extremely well attended. I mean, there's a good number of people, And I'm not criticizing, it's a good event, but I was expecting it to be very full indeed. And I was just wondering if the panelists had any comment on that.
Thank you. So any more questions? We have 5, which is plenty for our panelists to cover. So I will ask if who would like to volunteer to take the first question, which is in relationship to how we kind of bring the norms and practices with the tenure system, specifically when it comes to customary tenure system, to ensure gender equality on the relationship to land rights.
I can start, since we've already been starting from that end.
Fantastic. Go ahead, Alain.
On the question of customary land rights, yes, it is a rather tricky issue, and one that we've found it's not easy to deal with. But our research shows that when communities have legally recognized statutory rights, women's rights tend to be better off in general. What is lacking in most countries is just legal recognition of customary land rights and community land rights in particular. That aspect is often lacking in communities, in most countries, even though it's supported by international law such as CEDA. And the voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure and other principles. So there are a lot of important precedents, and what we're doing to that end is trying to work directly with women's groups and women's associations. We're actually right now developing a advisory group, gender advisory group, a global gender advisory group with specific chapters in each of the regions, led by women and men leaders who are interested in justice and gender justice, and they're spearheading initiatives to try to promote and get governments to recognize the legally recognize community customary tenure rights, so that by having those registered, statutorily recognized, then it provides a leverage to strengthen their rights. What to do about places where weak rights exist? I guess that's essentially what we're trying to do in most cases in countries we're involved. Getting women leaders vocally present, vocally engaged with government, with creating opportunities, creating windows where they can engage directly with these, with public officials and the private sector, which is a growing sector within which we're working, provides leverage. So for instance, the power and potential, the analysis that came out of this is leading us to develop now gender mainstreaming guidelines that will be incorporated into guidelines that we've developed for private sector engagement, so that the private sector can now more specifically recognize and respect women's land rights. And this is a whole new initiative, part of this group that we have called the Interlocking Group, which engages directly private sector entities in the recognition of land and tenure rights. And the importance of that is that they have huge potential, because we're working with huge multinational corporations that have lots of money and lots of resources, and they're recognizing that entering into places where customary or local tenure rights are insecure creates challenges and risks for them. So they're interested in making sure that those rights are secured, those rights are clarified before they engage, and that provides tremendous leverage for women leaders, local women leaders, to have their voice recognized with government and engage them. And finally, on attendance, that's a very good point. I thought actually the crowd was quite good compared to other venues that I've been in. But I guess the point that needs to be stressed on that is that women's rights is not just a women's issue, it's a social issue. And we're all involved, and it's all our responsibility to make it happen. So I'm glad you bring that up. Thank you.
Thank you, Alain, for that comprehensive response. I would pass the mic to Claudia Ringer.
Yeah, I'll maybe quickly comment on the HIV question. So the systematic review includes a Kenya case study where stronger women's land rights increased bargaining power within the household and therefore led to lower rates of HIV. There is another study that was actually this week, is being presented at IFPRI by someone from a university, where they studied all countries in Africa that follow either the common law or the civil law, whatever system. So the common law is more the British law, which actually, at least traditionally had extremely weak marital property rights. And the study found consistently that in those countries in Africa that follow the common law system, HIV rates were dramatically higher, and compared to those countries with civil law. And they also looked at, ethnic, like to make sure that it's not based necessarily on ethnic groups. So they also looked at ethnic groups that, straddle two countries, and they definitely found that it was the law structure. So, marital property rights is a pretty broad term, so not necessarily that much linked to land rights, but probably also linked to land rights. So there is clearly an entry point on HIV/AIDS that goes beyond health interventions that I hope people take up. On the, whatever, attendance, I mean, the challenge, I think, is that changing women land rights is not something you can do today and it's done tomorrow. So it's a long-term process. You need to involve a lot of stakeholders. I think you also have to be very clear that you're not trying to take things away from men. You're trying to work with women and men. You want to strengthen everybody's situation, rights, livelihoods, climate resilience, prosperity. I think you just have to make it very clear that that by strengthening women's land rights, you're actually strengthening everyone's future. And it's not a process. It takes, can take generations. And I think that's in part why it's usually not the top, climate adaptation strategy that's being promoted. But I think what's very important is to not forget it, and that a lot of other things, especially for example from CGR, we support a lot of agriculture technologies, but we just can't. So once we reach the women, we try to reach, benefit, and empower women. And even if once we provide all these technologies, even if they have the land rights, but if they don't understand, if there's the knowledge is not there what those rights convey, then we will not be able to be as successful as we could be. So I think that's the plea, to just not forget it, to keep working at it. Yeah.
Thank you, Claudia.
So thank you all for those questions. I'll address the first question, the tension between women's land rights and environmental laws in India and in particular. And we actually have 7 offices in India, and we struggle frequently with this question. I think one of the emphases that we place on women's land rights, on our approach to women's land rights, is that it matters who within the household has rights. Giving rights to a household is not sufficient to elevate the status of women. And so we work with our local staff to address social norms, and I'll follow up on what Claudia and Alain have already shared, is that, and that I think we all are familiar with, is that gender inequality is an entrenched problem all over the world, and so addressing it in this context is a matter of slow and strategic plotting change. And so we work with women's rights activists in India, with land rights practitioners, and we say it over and over and over and over and over again. And when it comes down to making actual policy choices, we try to say that it's not an either-or choice, but that it can be a both-and choice. We offer the rationale that you've heard today about how women's empowerment contributes to agricultural productivity, to household nutrition, household income increases, and also to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So to present this holistic picture of how empowering women can contribute to a host of benefits, both socially and economically, and in terms of climate change. The second question, there's some on sexual reproductive rights and land rights. There's some literature that suggests that when women have rights to land, there's a decrease in domestic violence. And we know with much more support in the literature that there is an increase in women's status within households when they have rights to land. So this increases their income, and status and income are 2 very big buffers against the sort of transactional sex that can lead to HIV infection, contraction. So that's one area that could use some further research if anyone in here is a researcher. So what to be done when there's an explicit legal issue? Someone asked that question, where a woman can't own property or can't advocate for themselves. Again, that's part of the slow legal work that we do. We work with local partners, we work with governments, we work on changing legal frameworks, and we advocate for the explicit inclusion of women's equality in constitutional and legislative frameworks, and then for the implementation of those rights down to local enforcement mechanisms in customary and formal systems. So we often run into that issue in our work, and the answer is just that it really depends on the context, it really depends on the project, but we try to take an approach that looks for where are the opportunities, where are the windows, where can we push to demonstrate the value of including women in decision making, of including women in the arena of people who hold rights, including women in the arena of people who have legal capacity. And it's not easy, but it's possible and can be effective in a number of contexts. I'm happy to talk in more detail about that later as well. The focus on land tenure security and food security at COP. I'd encourage anyone who's interested to come to the Women and Gender Constituency Caucus. It's every day in the Bond Zone at 9 a.m. In meeting room 3, and we're talking about the Gender Action Plan. There's a Women and Gender Constituency website you can go to and look at the specific list of demands for the Gender Action Plan. And we would welcome your presence there. We'd love to talk to you about how to see gender advocated for more strongly in the context of this particular COP. And then finally, attendance and the links between women's land rights and climate change. I also assumed that link was obvious. It's not well established in literature. There are links between climate change and land tenure. There are links between women's rights and climate change. There's growing evidence that women's land rights and climate change, or that three-way intersection, is strong, or at least maybe strong, but there's certainly room to continue exploring those issues. There's a critical need, actually, to continue exploring those issues. And I'm thrilled to see everyone in this room and thrilled to hear that this is a question others have been thinking about for a long time. So, but we obviously could use more people involved. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
I'm going to add to the last two questions, I think, that were asked. So are these solutions being implemented? In the COP space, the places that I would go to look for those questions are around adaptation and then also the agriculture negotiations. So for adaptation, I think it's quite critical to see, the global goal operationalized and see that progressing, seeing financing for adaptation progressing, seeing that gender is a huge part of all of that planning is going to be important, and that consideration. Agriculture negotiations, which is quite directly tied to food security, of course, has been a challenge in this space for many years. So a broad section of civil society at this point is calling for a joint work plan between the Substa and SBI on food security and agriculture as a way to sort of try to unstick some of the negotiations, perhaps, and then also really capture that food security is a key part of that, and we can hold that at the center and still have the negotiations we need to. As part of Paris, but beyond this space strictly, I also think that Paris is a bottom-up structure, as we all know, but that means that all governments right now are putting together a huge number of plans on how they're going to do their climate action. NDCs, National Adaptation Plans, or NAPs, technology needs assessments, mid-century strategies. Every single one of those spaces is really fundamental to women's rights and food security and land tenure rights. And that's part of the reason that we worked so hard in this space to get a collection of rights, a rights language in the Paris Agreement, and it's there, it's in the preamble. And so we would say that means that those human rights should be a starting point for all of those plans that governments are producing. But it is going to take people on the ground in those countries to fight that fight and make sure that they are there, in addition to fighting here to make sure that when we're looking at evaluating mid-century strategies and looking at evaluating NDCs, that those things are included as part of our consideration. And so finally on where are sort of the people and why is the buzz around this maybe not as high as we all think it should be. So I mean, I introduced ActionAid a little bit. I spend almost all of my time working on what would have previously been considered environmental issues. I work on climate change, I work on bioenergy, and I work on those things because they are so fundamental to human rights, food security, and women's rights. But I frequently have to remind people that I am not representing an environmental organization, and I am here because this is critical for the communities on the ground that ActionAid is working with. And so I think we have to be louder, especially right now with the impacts that we're seeing, to remind our friends in the environmental community that climate change is not an environmental problem. This is a fundamental human problem and a problem of survival and human rights. And I think we just need to collectively be louder about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. I just would like to add to that, I think because the sector of land and the profession to work on land governance, and land governance is perceived, from my perspective, being a very technical sector. The whole issue of land administration, land management is a technical area. At the same time, also the sector of environment. And I think, although the tendency is not, we are not having, the room is not overflowing, but I think those efforts of just initiating that dialogue, it's already a gain for us in terms of where we are now. The humanizing aspect of land governance. Land governance is not only addressed from the government or from the government perspective. It's a sector that it's addressed and needs to be resolved. It's a multi-stakeholder, many actors. And that's the past 10 years, I think, has been more and more accepted, and the dialogue has been initiated with the different sectors. And as Kelly was saying, the same way with climate change, we are trying to really get out of our comfort zone, from our box, and break the silos, because we are just accustomed to operate in our own silos. And so I think it is a great beginning, because the intersection of land tenure, climate change, and women's land rights is crucial to be addressed, as we saw here, as it touches upon so many different other issues. And we have, Landesa, we have this call for action, and one of them is actually more partnership to increase and enhance the body of knowledge and research around that intersectionality. I thank so much for all the questions. I think it was great to have that interaction, that back and forth. We have a few more minutes to go, and one third question that we had thought about to discuss a little bit here in dialogue is in terms of what should be done differently in terms for us to really move forward and leverage from where we are and from what it has worked. And what can be done differently to overcome the bottlenecks that we are facing. So I would like just to pose the question and have our panelists voluntarily to pick it up on that.
I can start again, unless anyone else wants to. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for the excellent questions and for being here. So I want to end with, and this also gets to the question, sort of too often in this space, we see proposals that risk human rights in the name of climate action. And when those risks are discussed, and I think we have made some progress in that they are being discussed more, it's talked about like this is a bug or a glitch that we need to sort of patch over with the right policy sort of temporary fix. But too often, those rights violations are actually really a feature of the climate action because it requires so much land or because it's not consulting with communities, that the human rights violation is actually a feature. And so we need to step back and really start with human rights, women's rights, land rights being at the core. Because there are solutions that are mutually reinforcing. And those are the solutions that are going to work better. And we do need solutions that are going to work, because it's fundamental that we limit warming to the Paris goals and aim and hit 1.5 degrees limit. But if we continue to treat human rights as sort of a secondary issue to be managed, we aren't going to get there, because the imposed solutions from the outside are too often false solutions that aren't going to work without community buy-in. But if we start with women's land rights, if we start with the human rights at the core of how we're thinking about the climate action in this space, if we start with them when when governments are planning their NDCs and their national adaptation plans, if they are part of the conversations at the CTCN, which works on technology transfers, we will be more successful, and we won't get to 1.5 without starting from that place.
So I'll start with evidence-based policy that is going to enable effective climate change action is reliant on better sex disaggregated data. We've touched a little bit on the idea that there's this growing body of evidence around women as climate change actors. I'll throw out just two examples. There's a recent program in Ethiopia that studied a joint titling and registration program and showed that when women were joined on the land titles, that there were increased conservation measures. There was a recent evaluation of a program in Niger that showed that when women were allocated plots of land and trained in bioreclamation techniques, that they were able to revitalize degraded farmland and also increase their nutrition and household income. So just two brief examples of how research can demonstrate these links very strongly. And we need bilateral and multilateral organizations and other funders and organizations to support research and pilot interventions that explore the links between land rights and climate change and use gender-responsive methodologies. Second, the Sustainable Development Goals. Governments can effectively address climate change and work to fulfill human rights at the same time by harmonizing their efforts at a national level to gather sex disaggregated data on land and climate change related indicators, especially in rural areas. Goal 13, which is take action on climate change, has no sex disaggregated targets or indicators, and neither does Target 15.3, which addresses combating desertification and restoring degraded land and soil. So when gathering data to support the SDGs, government representatives can advocate with their national statistical agencies and anyone else that's working on data gathering to link the sex disaggregated indicators on land under 1.4.2 and 5.8.1 and 5.8.2 to these climate change related targets and goals. And that will enable this harmonization at the national level of gathering information on these issues and linking them together in ways that don't exclude women. Third, and here I'm talking particularly to myself and others from the global north, we need to engage with and cede leadership to activists on the ground. We need to talk to farmers' organizations, women's rights groups, and local civil society, understand their perspectives, allow them to drive the development and implementation of programs and policy. Kelly touched on this earlier with the idea of green grabbing and forests being taken from local communities for conservation measures. That will not happen if we're designing these programs and consulting with local communities. We need to fund and facilitate the participation of Global South voices at events like COP and in all spaces where decisions are made to avoid this unnecessary tension between climate change engagement and human rights. And finally, for those of you engaged in UN advocacy, which is most of us here, so both here and beyond the UNFCCC, we can use specific provisions within the frameworks that we work with to press for greater attention to gender-responsive climate change programming and include a sex disaggregated understanding of the diverse interests and uses of land. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, all of those UN treaty monitoring bodies house provisions and growing bodies of work on the connections between women's land rights, indigenous people's rights, climate change, and food security. And we can and should use these frameworks and the guidance that they issue for leverage. Civil society and lobbying with governments and these international bodies themselves for government officials in lobbying nationally for better adherence to international law, for private sector actors in learning how to respect human rights. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Beth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd really just like to second everything that Beth has said, and maybe just a few more nuances on the evidence base. So I mean, what the systematic review has found, that there is certainly still limited evidence on women's land rights, climate resilience linkages. In part, how do we measure climate resilience? Obviously, it's a challenge. But what also came out is that there's a big challenge regarding comparable metrics for tenure security. Because you ask a question, do you own the land? Do you take decisions over the land? What kind of rights do you have? And it's a very broad space. And so as a result, obviously, the relative impacts on any type of climate resilience measure very much depends on that as well. And so it's a pretty wobbly space out there. And as long as we don't have comparable metrics for tenure security that are being used across programs and projects and that are being monitored consistently. The African Union has I think a land monitoring initiative, and I think IFPRI is helping them a little bit to set up some of the indicators, but the key really is that the countries develop them, commit to them, and then agree and harmonize them across the countries. Overall, however, even so we face all these challenges, there's very clear enough evidence out there to say that gender equitable land rights, so that is for both women and men. So yes, we do want to strengthen women's land rights, but we need that both women and men have secure rights to land. So the evidence is strong enough to say that it does support resilience, both through enhanced investments and improvements in the land, and obviously as a coping, it's an important asset that helps them to cope with climate extreme events. And I believe that we have this coping, adaptation, actually mitigation. I think land rights are essential for mitigation as well. But I think there also is have this potential for transformative change, because through empowering women, taking more decisions on behalf of their families. So I think women's land rights are a very important entry point to women's empowerment. In terms of what else to move this forward, I think we just have to make it more desirable, more sexy, so to say, to focus on women's land rights. It doesn't sound as great as carbon capture and storage or climatic engineering. So those are what are some of those words that people love. I think we have to make sure that none of these can be done without strong. Much stronger land rights, and to really make it clear that land rights systems are at the bottom of any other climate resilience strategy. So yeah, that's my plea, and we really need to make these NDCs more, give them a human face. I mean, as the previous speakers also said. Thank you.
Yes, well, lots has been said already, so I won't cover that. What we're finding is that in our own work anyway, we need to increasingly organize, train, and provide financial support directly to rural and indigenous women so that they can scale up their own initiatives and contributions to climate and development priorities, and ensure that their rights are recognized in both statutory and customary law. And as Beth and Claudia already alluded to, we need to support them with strategic analysis and evidence on the importance of women's land rights and create space for engagement with government and private sector so that governments develop and pass and implement national laws and regulations that explicitly recognize equal rights for all women and indigenous and rural women, applying internationally recognized rights, agreements, and targets such as CEDAW, the VGTTs, and the SDGs. And we need to support education, capacity building of governments and private sector on the importance of gender equality in all matters related to land use. And finally, I guess, we need to ensure and monitor enforcement of existing policies, targets, and laws that defend women's rights and access rights to land. So, essentially, thanks.
That's a long list of things we need to do differently, as we hear from the panelists, and I think we are doing this work and committed to follow through, but really seeking more partnership and really work more multi-sectorally with different stakeholders on that, so we can't do it alone. I would thank our panelists for that contribution and to make that panel happen. And I would like to thank also the audience for the participation. If there is any closing questions, remarks, I welcome you too to contribute. Otherwise, we have finished with the panel.
So, no
Any
question.
more comments, questions?
There is one.
Yes, one over there.
It's not a question. It's an assist. I think we need to be assisted. It's just like we've got children who were born free by the HIV mother and the HIV father. Those children, on the time when they grow up, they don't have anyone assisting them to look after themselves, like advising them not to get involved in sex activity without protecting yourself, because you're likely to be born free. If there's any research which can be done to assist those children, because some of them, they are shy, they wouldn't even know that the mother is HIV positive the time when they grow up, when they're teenagers, even the boys. The time when they get to teenager style, they get confused. That's where they start being infected, because the time they become teenagers, they're very proud of themselves. They can't get information from anyone. They're always secretive. So that's my request. How can that be done for those children to be not to be affected by the time when they are teenagers? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Claudia, would you like to address that?
There's one more question or not? No. Yeah, just sure.
Please join us. Yes. Add your question.
Hi. This is certainly not my view on the proceedings, but it seems like a complaint that could be made. What would you say if someone were to say that the West is responsible for the vast majority of the emissions that have led to climate change, and it seems like you could look upon everything that you've said as the West causing a problem, and then in the attempts through the international community to solve the problem they've caused, they're then pushing a human rights agenda on the rest of the world that the rest of the world hasn't bought into, and that could be regarded as a kind of Western-centric way of viewing things. What would you say to that kind of that criticism? That wouldn't be my position, but I can certainly imagine it being a lot of people's.
Last one.
Thank you. Last one, please.
Hi, I'm from Quebec, from Canada, but I'm actually here for a Peruvian women's organization. And I have a bit of experience in South Africa, and one of the things I have noticed for being a difficulty for women is education. So many places, young women, when they have a chance, when they reach the point where they have puberty, they can't go to school because in many places there's no water in the schools in many countries. So the women don't go, wind up staying at home, and their rights disappear with their puberty, when their puberty arrives. So I've been in the environment for many, many years, and I'm always stuck on how you can link environment, people's rights, and education. And I know it's a very particular thing, very complex, but I've seen it in a few countries. Education, giving a chance for education for younger women, keeping them in school, will lead to having their name on a piece of paper. Otherwise, it seems to be one more. You were talking, Ruth, I think, before, of things to achieve, and I think one of them is to keep women in school longer, younger women in school.
Yeah, we agree with that. Thank you. Would you like to address any?
I mean, just
relationship today?
Yeah, I think it's all comes together. I mean, so on the HIV question, I think really it takes a village, it takes a community to, put some rules in place of what's acceptable behavior and what not, and you have to be an example. So, and yes, and sometimes the examples are not there anymore because, we have orphans, etc. But it really has to come from the village. It has to come from the community and, extended family. And obviously, supported by regulation, supported by access to health services. I think this is really, I mean, once you need this framework in place, for teenagers and young people to see so-called the straight path. But I'm not the health expert here. On the female secondary education, yes. I mean, for us in terms of undernutrition, food security. Livelihoods choices, female secondary education is really on top of the agenda. And yes, there are many, that's one reason not having wash services in school is one of the many reasons why we don't see enough female secondary education. There's also norms, cultures in some countries. I mean, there is workloads, I mean, how do we make sure that we don't increase women's and children's time burden through some of those climate smart practices that we're supporting. There's obviously climate change that also affects, access to watering points, access to biofuel for burning, etc. So all of these factors contribute, can adversely affect female secondary education. Of course, there's other things like, solar home installation that might then again support education, but usually only if the parents or the mother is also educated. So yes, I mean, very clearly, anything we can do to support female secondary education will support all 17 SDGs, and obviously is essential for all the NDCs as well. So it really comes all together. And again, it takes the community, it takes both supportive regulation, access to education services, and and supportive policy on female secondary education. It's one of the most essential, possibly the most essential intervention.
So on the first question, I think around the world you find places where taboos on talking about sex result in all kinds of health issues, and I think honestly in openly addressing kids and their sexuality and providing information on reproductive health and rights, and then finding ways for those kids to have community even if they don't have immediate family. And then also to provide economic and educational opportunity for them wherever possible, which mitigates the risk that they'll engage in risky behavior, all those factors together. And then the second question, I think I'll separate it into two aspects. So first, I think your criticism that the West has caused climate change. Absolutely. I'm from the United States. I think it would be really remiss of me to say, to not take the opportunity to say that we are a contributor and that we are an active detractor from action on climate change, and that is reprehensible, and that there's only space for advocacy and for addressing that lax approach to what is essentially a question of survival for all of us. The second half of the question, are we now imposing a system that results in human rights abuses? I think in some ways, yes, we've talked about that a little bit, but I think the answer to that is, as I think all of us have touched on, is acknowledging that voices from the global south are the most important in these contexts. They're the ones with the local knowledge, they're the ones who are most affected. I want to emphasize that we've all been talking about people in communal tenure settings, rural settings, women in rural settings. We focus on rural people who depend on agriculture because they make up 75% of the people who live on less than $2 a day. And so when we're talking about people who are affected by poverty and people who are affected by climate change and people who live in community-based tenure settings, we're talking about the vast majority of the world's poor. And so from a human rights perspective, from just a compassionate human perspective, addressing climate change by listening to the voices of the people who are affected by it and are also affected by poverty is really, I think, the central needed approach. So I think the criticism is warranted. I think the answer to it is for people from the global north in particular to take a different approach than we have. And then the third question, one of the outcomes that we see from increasing women's status within the household and ensuring women's secure tenure is that their income increases, and when women's income increases and their status within the household increases, they tend to spend more money on girls' education and on children's education more generally. And so keeping girls in school is also related to land rights in that sense in many areas of the world. One of the big issues that we encounter in our work when we talk to communities, we say, what are you worried about? And they say, having enough money to pay school fees. It's one of the answers that we get. And so finding ways to increase incomes is an answer to finding ways to keep girls in school. And then, as Claudia mentioned, it's one needed aspect. There are many other needed aspects. There's access to hygiene products. There's access to water. There's protection from social norms and that prevent and detract from girls' education. I'll wrap that up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Beth.
On the education piece, I'll be really quick because I think this has been addressed by others, but I think that's one of the things that is interesting about this issue is that these issues are so interconnected. And so like ActionAid works on education through unpaid care burdens and tax policy, and there's a million other different ways to address these, and so that means we really need a comprehensive approach when we're looking at these issues. On climate change being a Western, a Western problem, something that Western countries have created, that's overwhelmingly true, like absolutely. And that's part of the reason climate is such a justice issue, because even though the United States has played a huge, by far the largest role in creating this problem, I would say, the people who are going to be impacted first and the people who are getting hit worst are actually poor people in developing countries around the world. So that's a key place where ActionAid has been active in this space. And so what we've worked with others in the NGO community on what we call the Civil Society Equity Review. And as part of that, we look at what is countries' historical responsibility, what is their capacity as far as how many of their own citizens are sort of living at a basic livelihood level, and really try to sort of put a number on, so what is a fair share of effort? And the truth is that like a fair share of effort from the United States is beyond what is possible to do in the United States borders, just scientifically. And so part of where we address that fundamental injustice is that rich countries should be supporting poor countries as they're doing this climate action. That's where conditional NDCs come in. And that's where things like the GCF come in. So I think we should address that head on, because this is a fundamentally unjust situation. And so we need to be starting from a place of human rights, starting from a place of justice as to how do we do this intervention and how do we do it in as just a way as possible.
Thank you, Kali. And Alain, would you like to?
10 seconds. Essentially, secure land rights are associated with stronger voting and leadership rights for women. And so strengthening land rights directly impacts their ability to govern and make decisions. Thus, if they're able to make decisions and engage in political processes, they're able to change the dynamics that young girls face and create opportunities for women over time.
Thank you. And also change structures and systems.
Yes.
Right? Well, thank you so much. Thanks again for the panelists and for us to be doing this panel together. Thank you for coming and joining us and dialoguing and having this conversation. Have a good day.
Thank you.